We've now spent a pretty good amount of time talking about our dynamic processors and effects, so we can now transition and begin to talk about the next category, which are frequency-based effects, or sometimes you'll hear this referred to as spectral processing, just meaning that we're making a change to the spectrum of the sound. And you already know what the spectrum analyzer does. We've looked at that span device. So somehow we're changing the frequency content of a sound, of a signal, of an instrument. And below I've wrote introduction to equalization and distortion, because these are the two primary effects that people tend to associate with frequency-based effects. So with an EQ, you're either adding or removing frequencies that already exist within a signal. And with distortion, you might be adding in new frequencies, and those may be harmonic or they may not be. And by the end of this section of videos, hopefully you'll understand all of this a lot better. We'll begin by talking about some ranges of frequency response that different species have. Human beings, it goes from 20 hertz up to 20,000 hertz. Sometimes you might see this abbreviated as 20 hertz to 20K, lowercase k, and then the uppercase h and the lowercase z. That k is just signifying 1,000. So if you see like 5K, 6K on an EQ, that means 5,000 hertz, 6,000 hertz, etc. You know from dog whistles that when you blow into those, you can't hear anything, but the dog's ears perk up. All right, that's because dogs have a much higher range in terms of frequencies that they can hear up to and perceive. And with dogs, it goes up to 50K or 50,000 hertz. And then dolphins, they have a very advanced hearing mechanism and forms of communication. So for dolphins, 150 hertz up to 150,000 hertz. But for human beings and for all of these species, these are just averages. And in the case of humans, the 20 to 20, that would be a human being who has absolutely perfect hearing and has never really exposed themselves to any damaging sounds and has to still be a particular age, because in nature and with our senses, nothing remains static. It's always changing a little bit, and no two of us are exactly the same. As you get older, you start to experience some roll-off. Okay, so you're not going to be able to hear probably 20 hertz anymore. Probably everyone watching this, or the majority of people watching this, it's going to be very unlikely that you can perceive and make out 20,000 hertz clearly. And also, if you expose yourself to very loud noises, or you listen to a lot of music in earbuds, and like you're riding, let's say, a train or something, and you put on the earbuds, you have to turn it up really loud, you're also damaging your hearing in some ways, but chances are you haven't damaged it enough to a point where you can't still make music. So just because you're like 60 or 70 years old and you can't hear up to 20,000 hertz anymore, it doesn't mean that you still can't make music. I just wanted to bring up and bring into this a little bit of biology. The other thing I want you to understand about frequencies in general, because right now these are all just numbers, right? Like what's 20 hertz, what's 50 hertz, who freaking cares? But what you will want to understand is that the lower the number, the lower the frequency, the longer the actual wavelength that exists. So if you have a subwoofer and then like a 2-speaker setup, for example, you look at that subwoofer and that cone, the diaphragm on that cone is usually like 10 inches. Sometimes they go up to like 15, 17 inches, 18 inches in diameter. And that's because it has to be that big to accurately displace enough of the air in front of it to represent a 20 hertz signal, because it's huge. It's very big. It's very long. And that's why when you work in smaller rooms and you don't have any absorptive materials, all of those low frequencies will go to the back of the room and kind of get trapped, and you'll have buildup in the corners because those frequencies have nowhere to go. They have a lot more energy to them and therefore are a lot more difficult to absorb. And the same is true, but in the inverse for higher frequencies. So once you start getting up to, 10K and above, that's coming out of the tweeter on your speaker, and that's like the smallest thing, but that's because it has to be able to vibrate so fast to accurately displace that air so that you're able to hear a frequency that high. All right, and those frequencies, they're very easily absorbed. Just the friction in the air will usually absorb most of those frequencies by the time they reach the back of the room. And this is also why you'll see in studios they might have foam overhead. Okay, that foam overhead is designed to deal with higher frequencies. You can't put acoustic foam in your corners and expect it to trap the bass. It just doesn't work that way. It's going to go right through it. It's not even going to really make a dent into those low frequency sounds at all. And so the idea here is that high frequencies, they kind of tend to rise up because the only place you're going to be able to hear them clearly is above, because if you think about it, you yourself are also something that the frequencies and these sound waves are having to go through. So you'll absorb a lot of high frequencies, but low frequencies, again, they're going to pass right through you, and low frequencies won't even really be absorbed all that well by carpet. So with low frequencies, those tend to sink down below. All right, so we're going to talk a lot more about acoustics in some of the other courses, specifically like the mixing course and setting up a good listening environment. For now, don't worry about it too much, but I did want you to be aware of that, because there is like a physical phenomena that accompanies these numbers, right? This 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. It's indicating cycles, really. So like a 20 hertz cycle is a lot slower than a 20,000 hertz cycle, and therefore the wavelengths, they, go along accordingly. We have this range of frequencies that we're able to perceive, but it's not really on an equal scale. Nothing in nature is perfect, and it's no surprise that as human beings, our hearing mechanism has evolved, and it's evolved for survival, like a lot of other traits that we have. So if you've ever been in a restaurant, or you've even been like on a plane and you had headphones on, for example, and you're listening to music, the second a baby starts crying or a baby is screaming out, you always are going to hear that. It really cuts through no matter where you are or what you're doing. And that's because our hearing is most sensitive in that sort of a range, in that like 3 to 5K range. And so when a baby cries out, you look around, you figure out where it is. And for the caretaker of that child, they're going to go and address whatever needs that baby is having. This range is also really important for speech. So if you had somebody with a really low booming voice, if we were hearing on like a linear type scale, we would probably have a very difficult time understanding those people, because this range here, the 3 to 5K region for like all of us, that's where the intelligibility in speech comes from. So like a lot of the consonants and stuff, if we weren't that sensitive, we would have a hard time understanding each other, especially if we were in a more noisy environment. Like if you're riding on the train or even sitting in a car next to somebody and you have all that low rumble, it would be really difficult to have a conversation with somebody because all you would hear was that low end. But luckily, because of this mechanism in our hearing, we are able to understand one another. And if those two examples don't make sense, think about when you're just listening to music in general. When the music is really low, you can't hear any low end at all. The bass just completely disappears. But as you turn it up, you start to hear some of that bass, and things kind of start to level out, and you get more of a balanced frequency response across the spectrum. And so this Fletcher-Munson curve, or it's sometimes referred to as the equal loudness curve, is showing us kind of like where it is or how loud we'd have to listen to have a more balanced frequency response. The more extreme these lines are, the more extreme that variation is. So at very quiet levels, we are very sensitive to regions up above, okay? To regions in that 3 to 5K zone and 1K up. But to low frequency, we're not really going to be able to perceive that so much or at all, and thus this really steep kind of a curve. But if we're listening up around like 80 or 90 dB SPL, which is different from the dB full scale, which is setting 0 as a maximum. With SPL, we're actually measuring those vibrations, those wavelengths. If we're at the 80 to 90 sort of region, we have a much more balanced curve. And so this is what people like to work at when they're making their music, because they're going to be able to hear low frequencies, and it's not going to be at this great imbalance. Because if you're working at, let's say, 40 dB and you're mixing your song at that, to hear the bass, you're going to have to crank that bass up by like 20 additional dB to be able to hear it. But then you're going to have all sorts of problems when you start to turn the volume up, and the bass is going to become overwhelming. So that's kind of how you read this Fletcher-Munson curve. And we'll talk about this more in the mixing course. But for now, I'm going to do a much better example, which is just listening to a frequency sweep from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And when you listen to this, you'll perceive parts of this as being a lot louder. But in reality, this is all just one amplitude level. Okay, so this is indicating to us the sort of range that we have in our hearing. And you can experiment and go back and listen at different volume levels with your headphones or on your speakers, and you'll notice how it kind of changes in difference. So if you listen really quietly, you won't really even hear any bass for a long time, but you will definitely hear, this range, this 3 to 5K sort of region. And then if you turn it up really loud, it won't be so sharp of a difference. You'll hear the bass, you'll still hear this part is louder, but it won't be quite as extreme. So let's take a listen, make sure that you have full range headphones or full range speakers hooked up for this for the full effect. So you hear that moment where it really starts to peak out, and that's where our hearing is super sensitive. But if I turn this down considerably and you leave your volume level the same, you're going to notice an even more extreme difference. So I'm going to turn this down quite a bit. We'll go back to the beginning of this audio file and play it again. In case you didn't believe me, we can actually look at the waveform of the sweep file and see that all the way across we're at the exact same amplitude. So this is illustrating a few different things. The one thing it's illustrating is that amplitude and loudness are two different things. Amplitude is a very technical number, so you can see where this level is peaking out at. That's telling us what the amplitude is. But our loudness and our perception of loudness has to do with our hearing mechanism. So what this is really proving is that Fletcher-Munson curve that we looked at before. Even though this is the same amplitude all the way across from a technical standpoint, when we're listening to this, the loudness is changing based on the frequency that's being played. For a lot of people, when they're making music, splitting up the frequency spectrum has been a way for them to really kind of classify and define particular regions within a sound. And so if it's helpful for you, I'd encourage kind of jotting this down or taking a screenshot picture of this and using it as a reference. This isn't a definitive guide in any way, shape, or form. All of these numbers are completely up to interpretation, and I just kind of jotted down what off the top of my head I thought would work well for different ranges. So when you read different books or you come across different guides online, they'll all have different numbers, and some of them will split the frequency spectrum up into even more categories than this, some of them even less. But just remember that this is all based on the material that you have coming in. So if you have a sound and its fundamental frequency is at, say, like 600 hertz, there's not going to be any low mid-range or any low end to that sound. If you have a sub and all you have is frequencies going up to like 250 hertz, there's not going to be any mid-range, there's not going to be any high end, there's not going to be any air or anything like that for you to be able to tamper with and tinker with. But people like these numbers, and they like it because it can help them learn a little bit quicker. So if you hear a sound and it's really bassy, for example, you'll say, oh, okay, that definitely is fitting into the low end. How do I need to change the low end to make it fit well with this other instrument? So that's just kind of the idea with this. These are somewhat arbitrary. And again, if you go other places online, you'll see them splitting out these numbers quite a bit differently here. And one of the reasons why we've tended to split the frequency spectrum into like these kind of nice and easy blocks is because for a long time, EQs we were working with were entirely fixed frequencies, meaning that somebody sat down and decided these frequencies are probably the most important ones that need to be changed on the majority of instruments. And so those are the ones that you're going to have access to. So you can see with this Pultec emulation, with the low frequency, we just have a certain number of frequencies that we can choose from. And with high frequency, we just have a certain numbers we can choose from. And then up there in high frequency, more towards like air territory, we have an attenuator, so we can turn those frequencies down. Nowadays, we have EQs where you can actually choose whatever you want, whatever frequency it is. So it's changed the game a little bit, but this is one of the reasons why we do see frequencies kind of split up over time. It's to make our EQ bands a little bit easier to handle and manage. I think a really good question that people should be asking right now is, how useful is it to really split our frequencies up into these really nice fitting little categories here? And I'd say it is somewhat useful, especially if you're a beginner, because if you're a beginner and you're making music, you don't know really where there's a problem in a sound, for example. If there's a resonant frequency in a sound, you're not going to know like where to go from instinct alone. And that's why having these categories can be very helpful. Because if you're listening to the sound and maybe you're looking at it in a frequency analyzer and you feel like the sound is way too dull, it needs to be brightened up, it can be useful to then go to your chart and say, okay, I can add some high mid-range to this. I can add some presence to this sound and it will make it sound a lot clearer. However, the problem with splitting it up in this way is that this isn't a perfect science. The beauty of making music is that it's a creative task and it requires the human being to make some of these choices and make these decisions. Otherwise, a computer could just do all of it. And there's no like perfect EQ curve for every single guitar. If there was, there'd be no point in people even making EQ plugins, because there would just be one thing and you would put it on there and it would make the guitar sound the best. But this is such a subjective field. And over time, the other thing that you will start to develop is an ear for just knowing what needs to happen to a sound. And I wish I could teach people like how to do that really quickly, but it's impossible. There's no like quick fix to just having an instinctual feeling when you're listening to a sound to know how you want to change it. But eventually that will happen. But until that happens, having some numbers, having some words to associate with different parts of the frequency spectrum, I think can be very useful and helpful to you learning a little bit quicker and starting to develop some of those instincts when it comes to the frequency spectrum of your sounds. What's the big difference between EQ and compression? Or I should say any sort of dynamic processing. With EQ, you're dealing with a static process. So if you decide to boost 100 hertz and you have a bass part that's playing all over the place, maybe it plays from 2 different octaves, the fact that you've boosted 100 hertz means that for one note, it might make a huge difference, and then for another note, it might make no difference at all. And a lot of people, for whatever reason, they don't really think about that too much. So you have to make sure that when you're making EQ changes, you're doing it for very specific reasons, or you're at the very least encompassing a wide enough range of frequencies where it's making a difference for every single note that's being played. With compression, limiting, transient design, or transient shaping, we're talking about a dynamic process. And a dynamic process means that it's occurring based on the signal that's coming in. So with a compressor, we're changing the volume whenever we breach that threshold. And so something is moving, something is reacting to the sound. With EQ, we're just kind of adding or taking away more of a frequency at any given moment. And it's not really dynamic. It's not going to say, okay, I want to increase the fundamental. I want to add more to the fundamental. So I'm going to put a sharp EQ band at 100 hertz because I see that's where the fundamental is to this bass. Well, what happens when they play a different note? That EQ band isn't going to magically move along with the person who's playing the part. So just keep that in mind when you are dealing with something like an EQ and why it can get you into trouble sometimes and when compression is a better idea. In that example, when you want to try to add more to the fundamental, compression makes a lot more sense because it is reacting to the actual incoming signal, whereas an EQ is something that's totally static. Next, we're just going to go over a couple of really important fundamental ideas involving EQ and distortion. With EQ, you cannot add something that isn't already there. Again, this is a static process that's just based on the signal that's coming in. So if you have a kick drum and there's no high-end energy in that kick drum, it's been filtered, whatever, there's nothing to grab onto, then your EQ is completely meaningless, like you see in this example. We have a high shelf at 6K, we've added 12 dB, but when we look at the spectrum on the other end, nothing has changed about this sound. It's exactly the same as it was before. So whenever EQing, you can only EQ what actually exists inside of the signal. This seems like common sense, but it isn't always. You know, sometimes you kind of just want to throw something on there and you want to add high end to your kick drum. Well, doing this, it's probably not going to have the impact that you want it to have. And that's where distortion comes in, because with distortion, you're able to add new harmonics and new frequencies that weren't there in the first place. Or you might be exciting something that already existed, which is then going to add new harmonic frequencies into the spectrum like what we've done here. So it's the exact same signal that's being fed in, but this time, instead of just going into an EQ first, we're actually going into a saturation device, and we're really driving that saturation hard. So this is distortion, and you can see how it's adding all of these new frequencies. And then from there, we can add an EQ and we can shape that distortion further. So now when I have my high shelf on here, it actually is making a difference and I can really hear it. And I know that I'm doing something. So that's kind of the difference there with EQ and distortion and how you might go about using those two different frequency effects. In my opinion, there are really three primary tasks or functions that an EQ is going to perform in the music making process. The first function is for fixing it. And this is uncommon today because people can easily re-record things, or you're working with multi-sampled libraries or really high-quality samples that have already maybe been processed to take out any severe imperfections that happened at the recording stage. But if you get a really bad recording, and I use bad in air quotes there, it's not as if everything is bad. That's up to the listener or the maker of the music to decide. But if you get a recording and you notice that there's a lot of like room resonances, or there's some serious tape hiss going on, or there's a lot of low end rumble, you're probably going to want to go in and fix that first before you even work with the sound any further. But this is up to personal taste. And I know when I'm making music personally, I go out of my way to go to places like Freesound or other places to download samples from people where I know there's going to be a lot of imperfections, and I actually really enjoy those imperfections. To me, that's what makes that sample interesting. So this is all in the ear of the beholder and the person actually making the music. If you're making pop music, or you want to get your song on the radio, or you want to get released on CD, fixing up those imperfections is going to be pretty crucial, because the average listener isn't going to like those imperfections. And so that's why you might use EQ as a means to fix a problem. The second application, and the application that we're going to be dealing with in this section, is the shape it function. So this is where it gets a little more experimental and creative. The sound is totally fine. There's nothing that you need to fix, but you want to reshape it entirely. You can do that with an EQ. You can make drastic changes to the sound or subtle changes to the sound to get something a little bit different. So that's another application and usage of the EQ. And finally, we have the massage it stage, or what I would call the mixing purpose of EQ. So once all of your sounds are put together, they might have sounded really cool by themselves, but all together it's becoming a little bit of a mess in terms of frequency response, and some things are masking other parts, or you don't have enough of, that you can't hear clearly the picking sound of a guitar, and you want to bring that out. That's when you're going to go into the massage it stage. And even if it's just 1 or 2 dB or 1 or 2 dB there, you're trying to clean things up so that your song as a whole can really work well for the listener to enjoy. And that's different than shaping it, because you might make some drastic shaping changes to a kick drum and then go in with the massage and actually kind of undo some of those things. But in the case of the massaging stage or the mixing stage, you're listening in context with other instruments to make sure that everything is going to blend nicely together. Let's wrap all of this up finally and just talk about a couple of things that if you've been going through this course, you probably already know I'm going to say. The first is that you want to make sure that you're listening first and you're acting second. So you want to hear the change that you want to make before you actually go in and make it. Now, that's a lot easier said than done, because if you're brand new to making music and you bring a sample in, you may not know how you want to change it. You may not feel like you need to change it. And if that's the case, just leave that sample in its raw state. Or you can bring on an EQ, go really crazy and experimental with it, and that's where you start to learn about how you're going to be shaping the sound's frequency content. All right, so it's very basic, but listen first and then act after you've listened to the sound and make changes that you want to make. And that again goes back to this idea of having an intention, knowing why you're bringing the processor on in the first place. And hopefully throughout this course, you're starting to see how that's going to help you when you're making your music. And if you don't have an intention, don't bring anything on. So in the next few videos, we're going to talk about these processors in a little more depth, how they technically work, and then hopefully you'll figure out how you can creatively use them for your own music.